It was 2:43 a.m. when Arun sat up in bed, wide awake. Not from a nightmare, not from a sound, just from something inside him that refused to stay quiet any longer. He looked around his dark room, the same posters on the wall, the same half-folded clothes, the same untouched notebook on his desk. And in that silence, he realized nothing had changed in months. Not his goals, not his habits, not his mind. The truth hit him harder than he expected. He had been drifting, scrolling, postponing, telling himself soon and later and just one more day. He'd mastered the art of distraction, and now it was catching up to him. His phone lit up, a notification. He didn't check it. Instead, he whispered something out loud, barely audible, but heavier than anything he'd said in a long time. "What am I even doing?" No one else heard it. But for Arun, it was the first honest thing he'd said to himself in weeks, and once it was out, he couldn't unhear it. Arun didn't go back to sleep. He sat in bed, legs crossed, staring at the ceiling. Not thinking about anything in particular, just feeling the weight of everything he'd avoided. He thought about the projects he never finished, the people he ghosted, the goals he once said out loud and then buried under procrastination. He remembered how many times he'd opened a new tab to start fresh, only to end up scrolling. How often he'd waited for motivation that never came, and it all started to feel real. Not like guilt, not like shame, more like truth finally breaking through the noise. He stood up and walked to the desk, picked up the old notebook he hadn't touched in months. The first page was blank. The second had a quote scribbled at the top. "The future is shaped by what you do when no one is watching." He had written that line himself months ago, and then never lived by it. He stared at the words and felt something shift, something that wasn't loud or dramatic, just a deep, still realization. This version of me is not who I want to stay. He didn't rush into anything. He didn't declare a new goal or promise himself a 5 a.m. routine. He just sat there, notebook open, pen in hand, staring at the space where his thoughts were finally beginning to breathe. And for the first time in a long time, he wrote a single sentence. "I don't want to wake up years from now and feel this way again." That was it. No blueprint, no strategy, just that one line. It was raw, honest, enough. Because he realized change doesn't need noise, it needs truth. And the truth was this: he had been sleepwalking through his own life, smiling on the outside, waiting for things to click. But life doesn't click. It builds, slowly, from small decisions, from the courage to stop pretending, to stop hiding behind distractions and start looking at yourself with open eyes. And tonight, this quiet, sleepless night, wasn't rock bottom. It was the beginning. Not because something magical happened, but because he had finally stopped lying to himself. If this story feels familiar, hit subscribe and tap the bell, because the real wake-up call isn't loud, it's honest. At sunrise, Arun hadn't slept, but for once he wasn't tired. His body was still, but his mind felt awake, not hyper, not anxious, just present. He made tea, no music, no noise, just the sound of water boiling and birds outside starting their day, like they always had, even when he didn't notice. He sat by the window, notebook in lap, and asked himself a new question. What's one thing I've been avoiding that I could face today? The answer came faster than expected. An email he'd ignored for weeks. From someone offering him a small freelance opportunity, something he thought wasn't big enough to matter. Something that scared him because it meant actually starting. He reopened the email. His hands trembled as he typed. Not because it was hard, but because it was real. He didn't overthink it, didn't wait for the perfect response. He just answered. A few hours later, the reply came in. Glad to hear from you. Let's begin this week. Arun stared at the message. It wasn't a huge moment. No spotlight, no applause. But it felt like something cracked open, like momentum, no matter how small, had finally returned. The days that followed weren't dramatic. Arun didn't suddenly become a different person. He didn't wake up at 5 a.m. or fill a vision board. But he showed up. He answered the email, completed the task, then another, slowly, without perfection, but with presence. Each small action whispered back to him, "You're not done. You're just beginning." He still had bad days, still caught himself falling into old patterns, scrolling too long, overthinking, hesitating. But now, he noticed. And when you notice, you can interrupt. He'd close the tab, take a breath, return to the notebook. Not to write pages of goals, just one question, one sentence, one reminder. One night he wrote, "I can't change my past, but I can stop rehearsing it." And that line stayed with him. He stopped measuring his life in grand achievements and started measuring it by his own honesty. Had he shown up today? Had he kept one promise to himself? That became his new success metric. Because the truth is, reality doesn't hit all at once. It taps. It waits. Until you finally answer the knock. A week later, Arun ran into an old friend at a cafe. They hadn't talked in months. After the usual small talk, the friend said, "You seem different, like you're tuned in again." Arun smiled but didn't explain. Not because he didn't want to, but because the shift was still too quiet, too personal to describe. He hadn't changed jobs, hadn't gone viral, hadn't reached some massive goal, but he had started showing up, in ways no one saw, on days that felt invisible, in moments that used to pass unnoticed. And that was the real transformation, not in the outcome, but in the orientation. He had gone from someone waiting for permission to someone taking small, deliberate steps. He wrote less about what he should be doing, and more about what he was doing. One morning, while journaling, he wrote, "Maybe real growth isn't visible. Maybe it's just the feeling that you're no longer hiding from yourself." And that thought gave him peace. Because now, he wasn't chasing some distant version of himself. He was becoming him. One decision, one response, one truth at a time. One night, nearly a month after that 2:43 a.m. wake-up, Arun found himself back at the same spot, sitting on his bed, lights off, silence everywhere. But this time, something was different. He wasn't wide-eyed with panic. He wasn't spiraling. He was simply still. And that stillness didn't scare him anymore. He thought about how much time he used to waste, not just on distractions, but on delay, on convincing himself that he needed to be more prepared, more confident, more ready. Now, he saw how much of life happens in the middle, not at the beginning or the end, but in the in-between, the boring, quiet middle, the unglamorous stretch where discipline grows and clarity breathes. He looked over at the notebook. It was halfway full now. Pages of reflections, moments, real words, no fluff, no filters. He picked up the pen and wrote, "I used to wait for something to wake me up. Now I realize I'm the one who has to stay awake." And with that, he closed the book and smiled. Not because everything made sense, but because he was finally present enough to face it. The next morning, Arun didn't scroll, didn't rush. He sat in the sunlight spilling across his desk, hands around a warm cup of tea, and just breathed. There were still things unfinished, still goals untouched. But now, he wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't avoiding his life. He was in it, fully. Not every day would feel like this. He knew that. There would still be off days, lazy mornings, messy feelings. But now, there was an anchor. something inside him that refused to drift anymore. He didn't need to announce anything, didn't need to post about how he was back, because he wasn't trying to impress the world. He was simply showing up for himself, one quiet morning at a time. And he knew now, the wake-up call people talk about, it's not always loud, it's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a whisper in the middle of the night that simply says, "This is not the life you want to sleep through." And if you're brave enough to listen, that whisper becomes the beginning of everything.